I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, today, it's obviously a pretty busy week. There's a lot going on. First, Amber's going to talk about the fires in Los Angeles, which has obviously been really devastating, and so updates there. Next, I'll be talking about Jack Smith's releasing his report on President Trump. Next, and then Inez will talk about Senate confirmation hearings. And finally, Ben will talk about the report on Hunter Biden, another special counsel report. So with that, we'll kick it off and turn it over to Amber.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I mean, obviously, a tragic, devastating story. There's nearly 30 people confirmed dead at this point, thousands of homes destroyed in the LA wildfires, which have been sweeping across the county. And the larger conversation here and how it relates to us is that this was a massive policy failure by every level of governance in California, from the city mayor, Karen Bass, who was well aware that the Santa Ana winds and the relatively dry conditions in California were giving the potential for a wildfire of this magnitude, and still decided to fly to Ghana after promising that she would never go abroad after she was elected mayor, and then coming back and taking issue with the fact that people had questions about her travel and why she decided to go, when pretty much every warning available was that these fires were quite possible. Up to California, the governor, Gavin Newsom, who slashed money from the fire budget and claimed that all four of the water reservoirs were full, but in fact, one of them had been recently drained prior to the fires so that it could undergo repairs. Then at the same time as all of this, California consistently pumps the vast majority of its water back into the Pacific Ocean to save an endangered fish called the Delta smelt, because apparently fish lives matter more than human lives. You've got Mayor Bass similarly cutting the fire budget by $17 million, while the city also spends money on transgender midnight cafes and gay men's choirs and Juneteenth celebrations, at the same time that Mayor Bass claims that they're basically in a tight budgetary period, and that's why she has to cut funding for emergency services. Not to mention the fact that California every year fails to come even close to meeting its prescribed burn goals. You've got all kinds of climate change obsessed loonies out there who refuse to do basic forest maintenance because they claim it hurts the environment. I wonder how any of that would hurt the environment more than the massive fire we're seeing right now. But alas, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of common sense in that state. Some people have even gone so far as to blame Trump, turning this into a commentary on whether or not he would cut emergency funding or federal funding from California when he takes office. Just purely hypothetical speculation because they can't stand to take accountability for their own actions. But I'll turn it over to the group just to, if you all want to weigh in on some of the other policy failures that are taking place, whether or not California is going to be able to rebuild from this. And then the other question I'm curious about is Congress is going into obviously a budgetary process. There's been some whispers from Speaker Johnson and other Republicans that there should be conditions placed on whatever emergency federal aid does go to California at this point. What do you think those conditions, if any, should be?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really frustrating topic, I think, for those of us who are from California and have seen this film before. This is just like the worst iteration of it. It just happened to be the most damaging. I mean, I think this fire is going to be California's most damaging, at least since 1906, burned most of San Francisco. I mean, in terms of the damage and the entire neighborhood's gone. This is just one of those frustrating things about the beautiful state of California, which is that it's not only that the progressive governance is wedded to a bunch of nonsense, ideological goals that make living there extremely annoying. It's that basic competence is displaced by those goals. And that's what we've seen in here. This is not This was very predictable. It happens every few years. It's just was a matter of time before it happened in a place that was like really populated with a lot of homes. And the toll got as high as it is getting. And by the way, the danger is not over. Los Angeles County, I think, is again under red flag warning today, but this happens each time at this year. What's changed, and the climate change excuse, even if it were true, is not an excuse, right? It doesn't absolve you. First of all, I don't think it's the proximate cause here, but second of all, it doesn't absolve you of the requirement to try to do something about these devastating fires instead of just trotting this out, global warming, as an excuse. But everything Amber kind of alluded to is correct. California has not done the basic maintenance that even the natives of California, the Indian natives, used to do. They don't do enough controlled burns. They have all kinds of wackadoodle environmental regulations that make maintaining the forests safely and preventing these kinds of huge conflagrations necessary, right? They don't do that stuff for various ideological and incompetence reasons. The reservoir, problems are a long-term problem. The previous Democratic Governor Brown did not build any new reservoirs in California. There have been basically no new reservoirs built in California, even though there's a half-tag federal subsidy for building them. And California consistently has drought problems worse than Arizona's, right? So because the government refuses to build reservoirs in a competent way. So this is very much, I don't know if this will be a wake-up moment for California or not. I hope so. Unfortunately, I'm kind of cynical about the matter, but I hope so. I hope this wakes people up to the cost of this kind of ideological governance that goes well beyond our back and forth, well beyond cultural issues, well beyond, whether your taxes are higher or lower, but go to the core competencies that is actually necessary for government to perform, and that the government of California hasn't done for a very long time. So this just makes me angry. I don't know if you can tell, this is, it's just frustrating to see something so predictable become so devastating for so many families.
Yeah, I think to reiterate kind of at a broader level some of these points, these are the fatal consequences of progressive ideology and the associated maladies of hyper incompetence and mismanagement all rolled into one. This is what happens in terms of when you put things over merit, which you can't have when it comes to health and public safety. Of course, the chief charges of state and local authorities. Obviously, this is the disastrous consequences of the environmentalism on steroids there. And by the way, what's been the consequence for the atmosphere as a consequence of these massive fires, and for the already terrible breathing air and smog that you already had in California. The consequences of the green policies are actually going to be infinitely worse for the environment, not to mention the consequences for the people who actually have to live in the environment, whose lives have been upended, homes destroyed, businesses wrecked, etc. And first of all, you literally can't replicate some of what was destroyed, certainly in the Pacific Palisades. Beyond that, I'm very dubious of the notion that there's going to be any kind of rebuild given the progressivism that dominates. And I think we've seen Gavin Newsom say he's going to have some sort of executive order to get rid of red tape. Okay, I'll believe it when I see it. There's been a lot of questions, in terms of the political second and third order consequences of this. Is this going to flip Californians? Are they going to say they've had enough and vote these people out? Are they going to vote with their feet? I think the jury is still out on all of that. And then on the, conditioning of aid, I think you have to ask the question, why wouldn't you condition the aid given the criminal negligence that we saw from the authorities in place in California? So this is a travesty, a tragedy all around. My heart is with folks there. I know family and friends who are there dealing with these consequences. It's utterly disastrous, and this is the ultimate man-caused disaster, sadly.
Yeah, I find it, normally there is a good argument to say that disaster aid shouldn't be coupled with strings or contingencies, but I think if there's a case where the state government is actively doing things that are making it making it easier for disasters to do a lot of damage, or making it harder for people to recover, then there's a very compelling argument to say, yeah, actually, we need to change things. Like we need to see that these strings are attached. Imagine a circumstance where they were talking about hurricane relief to Florida, and for some reason, Governor Ron DeSantis had been shutting down like code restrictions or essentially loosening codes to make it easier to build buildings that were not hurricane proof. I think that the federal government might look at him and say, like, well, a lot of this damage is as a result of your policy failure. So if we're going to give you this aid that your state needs, it's going to come with a string that you impose the policy changes necessary to prevent the harm in the future or to mitigate it. And I think that that's exactly what ought to happen in California. It's insane that we keep having this every few years. There are just massive fires everywhere, and it's like the government doesn't do what it needs to do to both make sure it has enough water, vis-a-vis like the delta smell or filling the reservoirs or anything else, or making sure that the brush is being cleared. They're all invested in DEI nonsense and environment and Sierra Club nonsense as opposed to actually helping protect against disasters. All right, moving on. It goes to me. So we're talking about Jack Smith's report. At 1 a.m. last night, Jack Smith's report was finally released. Eileen Cannon removed the last injunction, and Smith released it. It was the first part of his report that basically repeated a bunch of the allegations against Trump that Smith had made in his indictments. It really is not new. I mean, it is just a rehash of everything that was in those indictments. There was 1,000 pages of content that was, put out by Jack Smith in September. These indictments have been floating around for years now, and all the facts alleged in them have been alleged repeatedly before, even the specific ones. So it's just a last-minute swipe by the Department of Justice as Jack Smith goes out the door. And the real deep irony here is that people are, this is a report that needs to be esteemed. It's like, no, it's a blog post by a private citizen. Jack Smith was not properly appointed as special counsel. Eileen Cannon found he's a private citizen and he's just writing a blog post. And it's particularly inappropriate because Smith himself has refused to dismiss the case with prejudice. So all these charges that he's thinking about still bringing are open, which means that the Department of Justice, by his own policy, should not be releasing any of this information to the public. And yet it's, Garland and Smith are violating their own rules. They're ignoring the fact that the only judge to rule on the issue has found that Smith wasn't properly appointed, and they're releasing this report that doesn't add anything new, but just it's one last slap at the incoming president. It brings to mind that, I think we need to probably shorten the lame duck period going forward. I think that, both in this lame duck period and in Obama's lame duck period 8 years ago, a lot of mischief was done by the sitting president. It's something we need to wrap up. Once the election's over, we need to get the new president in there ASAP. And I think, also it demonstrates just how, it's like they're looking for their last symbolic sore loser slap that they can get, right? Like that was also, there was the sentencing that happened last week. And that sentencing was the same thing. It's like, we're sentencing you to no punishment whatsoever, but we've proven that you're a convicted felon. Like none of these symbolic labels mean anything in a world where the underlying process used to achieve the label was not dispassionate, was not the product of a disinterested justice system. So I don't think that's the primary reason people don't respect it. But I'm curious what you guys all think about the Smith report.
I found it pretty amazing that in the New York Times' write-up of the report, they basically admit that there wasn't much new here outside of the indictment. And in fact, one of their paragraphs reads, while there had been some speculation that Mr. Smith's report would provide new details about several unindicted co-conspirators, the report turned out to say little new about them. And the rest of it just repeats the graphic descriptions of January 6th as if that somehow demonstrates Trump's criminal liability or culpability. But this thing basically is a nothing burger. We've already seen all of this before. It shouldn't have been allowed to be released in the first place, but the fact that it's getting such little coverage and the coverage it is getting is very skeptical from even legacy and mainstream media sources, I think kind of tells you everything you need to know.
One observation on the merits, I didn't find this, but I saw it pointed out on social media, and I think it is important to highlight the notion of insurrection. Part of the entire narrative information operation that has been foisted on us since January 6th was that it was an insurrection, and that because it's an insurrection, this proves that the MAGA movement is composed of domestic violent extremists or terrorists, and consequently, we have to prosecute the case against them accordingly, using a whole of society apparatus weaponizing and targeted against potentially tens of millions of dissenting Americans. Well, Jack Smith himself says in this report, the office recognized why courts described the attack on the Capitol as an insurrection, but it was also aware of the litigation risk that would be presented by employing this long dormant statute. Translation, they didn't think they could prove in a court of law that this was an insurrection. And that's why, of course, they never charged anyone with insurrection. It was a rhetorical tool, but they tried to give it the legitimacy of being a legal term of art when it wasn't. And that's something that ought to be emphasized over and over again in the entire phony effort that they used to elevate a riot into a quote unquote insurrection that threatened the very fabric of the republic and was on par, remember, they claimed, with Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Civil War, etc. This was exactly the last gasp effort you'd expect from a zealot like Jack Smith was, who previously had been repeatedly smacked down by the Supreme Court, was smacked down by the Supreme Court here as well. And again, the question remains, though, what's the deterrent to this behavior long term? What is the DOJ going to do to mitigate the disastrous impacts of these quote unquote cases that were brought? There probably needs to be some kind of reckoning around special counsels going forward as well, which has been something that Congress has been debating for a long time, independent counsel versus special counsel and what the rules and regs are, et cetera. Maybe there ought to be a reckoning there as well. But I think this is a fittingly shameful end, hopefully, to Jack Smith's lawfare inquisition. And thankfully, like his other prior lawfare inquisitions, he was pretty decisively defeated here.
Yeah, I can only add, I mean, there's this sort of flavor in this document of self-referential within the same communities, right? So he basically tells people to trust him because everyone he has worked with has said that he's a good guy and he would never do anything for political reasons, right? And I was thinking about how totally unconvincing that is, not just to obviously those of us on this podcast, but I think generally to Americans, that kind of institutional self-reference, and basically like that wink, wink, trust me, like it's all good. I have, my friends say that I'm fine, and the people I work with say that I'm not a political hack. Like the fact that he thought that would be worthwhile at all to include shows how far how much he doesn't understand, I think, the American public's reaction to this. And not to repeat myself from previous podcasts, but there was a large chunk of Americans in the exit polling and the pre-polling saying that democracy was their most important issue, or the future of democracy. And Democrats thought that was, of course, their lines against Donald Trump. But a large percentage of those Americans voted for Trump. And this is what they were talking about when they say that they were worried about the future of democracy. It's exactly this kind of like self-referential, trust me, institutional, the reliance on institutional trust by actors who have completely eviscerated public trust in the institutions which they represent. So yes, I do think this is a fitting coda, but with the asterisk that Ben himself mentioned, which is what is going to prevent this from happening again. Obviously, in terms of the immediate consequences, both Trump and JD Vance say that they will be reviewing the January 6th convictions and improprieties there and try to restore justice of some kind to a lot of people who were either innocent or committed incredibly minor crimes and then were pursued as though they were, the FBI's top wanted list, right? In a totally authoritarian way. But in terms of going forward, there has to be something. I don't think like just edging the rules around, special counsels and stuff. That's a legitimate debate. Scalia was famously like involved in this debate. I think there's a legitimate debate as to whether having special counsels at all is a good idea, whether it's anti-democratic, but I don't think that's really going to be sufficient. And I know that Ben doesn't think that's sufficient to deal with the rot that's in DOJ and in the FBI.
All right.
Let me just add, it's insufficient because the only people who ultimately rendered justice were the American people. All of this would have persisted if Donald Trump had not won.
Right. And that also kind of proves the irony of like even bringing it in the first place. Like, you want to publish a report about something that already a verdict has been issued by the American people, like too little, too late, it doesn't matter. Old news. Asked and answered is I think actually the right way to frame it. All right. With that, we'll move on to The next one is Inez in the Senate confirmation hearings.
Thanks. There are a bunch of Senate confirmation hearings, one going on as we record this right now on Tuesday is Pete Hegseth, which is going to probably be one of the more interesting ones, just to preview what's coming up the rest of the week before we dig into the Hegseth confirmation. Kristi Noem is doing her hearing tomorrow. Pam Bondi is having the first of two hearings tomorrow. Rubio, John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director nominee, Sean Duffy, Chris Wright at Energy. Russ Vogt at OMB, which is really important, even as most people don't know what the OMB is, but bureaucrat wrangling. Thursday, Burgum, Lee Zeldin at EPA, Pam Bondi's second hearing. So we're going to be having just confirmation hearings basically all week. A couple of the most controversial picks are later. So for example, RFK Jr. is coming later. But this first round seems to be mostly the people that Trump is pretty confident will get confirmed without too much trouble. So far, and it's quite early, it's still going on. The Pete Hegseth hearing seems to be going well for the nominee. Some very funny exchanges. I think he came out on top in most of them about, for example, people complaining about JAG officers. I'll let you look that up on your own. Some mentions of his personal life, right, and the attacks that were made on his personal life by some Democratic senators. But I don't know. I don't know what you guys think, and I'll open it up in a minute. But I didn't feel like those attacks really landed very well, and they've been kind of a minor part of the hearing. So this is not necessarily going to turn into Kavanaugh round two, which is, I think, a good sign, especially about where the right is about these kinds of accusations and how politicized they are, and recognizing that fact. But JD Vance had some good commentary, actually, I want to mention on X, the website formerly known as Twitter, about these hearings and the attacks on Hegseth, saying basically that they land badly from both an administration and generally a political establishment that hasn't won a war in 3 decades. And that's really what this nomination, what the discussion of this nomination really should be about. It's the fact that we clearly have a military that has a recruiting crisis, that has an incompetence crisis among its highest ranks, not at all among the rank and file or even among mid-level officers, but among the highest ranked generals, who seem to only get promotions despite losing wars. And ultimately, that's hopefully what this nominee is there to change, as well as making sure that any kind of DEI apparatus or diversity initiatives and anything that it comes above the military mission in the military is uprooted and destroyed. And that's really, I think, what Hegseth has made the theme of his remarks and his sort of candidacy for this position. Overall, I don't know. What do you guys think? Like, you think it's going well? Oh, actually, one more little bit for the discussion. One of the things that Hegseth has been attacked for, even by Republicans, by the Iowa senator. Sorry, I'm blanking on her name, mommy brain, but Ernst. Yeah, my husband just walked by. Jody Ernst, right? And even Tom Cotton, making sure that he supports women in the military. Famously, Hegseth has said that he did not support women in combat roles. I think that's an eminently reasonable position, but he has said that it's not really his job. The job he's looking for to be in. He's not going to be making that decision. It's a policy decision above him. But he's gotten some attacks from Republican senators on that, which I thought was notable and worth bringing to the discussion. Anyway, how do you think this is going, and how do you think the rest of this week is going to go in terms of this long string of confirmations?
I think it's been going really well for Pete Hegseth. I've been really impressed by his answers to some of the tougher questions. And there was a really funny viral moment just a few minutes ago as of recording, where he was getting questioned by Senator Elizabeth Warren about a pledge that generals who serve in the military should not go directly into the defense industry for 10 years. And she asked him if he was willing to make that same pledge, and he had to remind her that he is not a general, which is pretty hilarious. Really caught her a little bit on her back foot. But yeah, I don't think the personal attacks have been landing too well. I mean, Tim Kaine was trying to sort of thread this needle where he was comparing the oath that you take to your spouse as to the oath that you take when you join the military, and basically trying to make the claim that because Pete Hegseth did not uphold his vows in marriage by engaging in extramarital affairs, that he couldn't be trusted to uphold his oath to the country. And it definitely seemed like a stretch to me. And I thought Hegseth did a fine job sort of navigating this trap that Tim Kaine was trying to lay for him. More generally, some of the things that I've been noticing just from sources I've been talking to and some of the public reporting that's been coming out related to the confirmation hearings is that there's basically three threats, um, immediate threats to some of the nominees. One is the ineffectiveness and speed or lack thereof of federal bureaucracy. There's been a couple of individuals whose paperwork has been either delayed or not passed on in a timely manner, which has led to their confirmation hearings getting delayed. Number two is Democrats sort of intentionally stonewalling by asking for additional documents or paperwork that wouldn't typically be required for past nominees or confirmation hearings. Tulsi Gabbard comes to mind, where her team has claimed they've provided everything that they're required to, and the Democrats are still demanding more and basically just trying to push her as far to the back of the line as they possibly can. And then three, there's been a couple of people who have actually been delayed a little bit by whoever's handling the confirmation process with the Trump transition team, because the documents were sent in like a day or two late. Nothing major, but just a slight delay on that front. So those three things are sort of combining to slow things down a little bit. But in terms of the actual votes, the way that these individuals are going to perform in the hearings, I think they're all incredibly competent. They're all very well spoken. I think a lot of the concerns that either establishment Republican senators have, or maybe some of the more moderate Dems might have outstanding, will probably feel pretty minor after we get through the actual process of these people getting questioned by senators.
So really briefly, I wrote in the Federalist to kick off this first week of confirmation hearings that sort of the individual hearings aren't really the issue, nor are the attacks and the purported merits or demerits of the attacks that are going to be raised on these nominees. At the end of the day, the assault that the Democrats are going to engage in, and maybe some squish GOP senators, although the jury's still out on that, will engage in, is ultimately about a major battle in the war to faithfully execute the MAGA agenda and fulfill the mandate that Americans voted for in November. And if you allow the Democrats to draw blood, it'll start a feeding frenzy and it'll imperil the first 100 days, that entire project. And then ultimately, of course, and this is what you would think the Craven senators, at least, and the cynical ones would care about, their own self-interest, because if the agenda is destabilized and undermined, ultimately it's going to redound to their detriment, especially if they're up in 2 years. So at the end of the day, I think this is a test of Republican senators knowing what time it is or not. We'll see how it plays out. In early questioning in the Hegseth confirmation hearing, I think Democrats tipped their hand that they really didn't have anything that wasn't already out there. Interestingly, the ranking member, Senator Reid, sort of went down this line of questioning about alleged emails, that threatening emails that people were sending to military officers, talking about how, basically you were a supporter of the Obama Biden agenda and wokeness, and we're going to purge you and your pension's going to be imperiled, et cetera. And he tried to use that to suggest that there was some nexus between what Pete Hegseth had said and those emails, or some attribution or attempt to say, look, this is the same line of argumentation that you guys are making about an ideological purge in the military. And it fell very flat. And I think that set the tone from the jump for the lines of questioning that we saw. Democrats predictably raised the issue of women in combat, purported financial mismanagement, alleged infidelities. Tim Kaine, thus far, and we're recording while the hearings are ongoing, but made probably the most gratuitous lines of attack about those purported infidelities. Of course, Democrats never cared what happened in people's bedrooms until, a Republican is on the stand, essentially. But setting that aside, I really don't think that they've drawn blood at this point. Maybe Kaine was attempting to get under Hegseth's skin. He put forth all these hypotheticals to, again, try and indirectly smear Hegseth. And Hegseth stayed very much on message and on point, as you would expect him to acquit himself there. So I think overall, the hearing has gone well. And most importantly, what Hegseth has shown is that he wants to make the military lethal, that he wants to prioritize merit and excellence and dominance over everything else. He's energetic. He provides the perspective of someone who witnessed the successes and the failures of the so-called global war on terror. And I think all of that redounds to his benefit. It's good for the American people to see on display the contrast of the sort of military establishment versus the change agent. And I think he rightly made the argument that the attacks on him are ultimately about challenging the Trump change agenda at the Pentagon. That's what it's really about. And that's why it's so significant that he ultimately be confirmed and that all the other nominees are confirmed as well.
Yeah, I think that, I'm just going to talk briefly about the Hegseth confirmation. It's wild that the Democrats think they can get away with thinking they can be the moral arbiters of rectitude in marriage. There's video of Tim Kaine 3 months ago campaigning with Doug Emhoff, who he wanted to put in the White House, who cheated on while married, cheated on his wife with his nanny, impregnated his nanny, and paid for her abortion. Tim Kaine was on a ticket with Hillary Clinton, to put Bill Clinton back in the White House. These people, suddenly all of a sudden, a Republican comes in. It's like Tim Kaine thinks he can be the moral arbiter of rectitude in marriage. Absurd, ludicrous, and just generally, I think it shows it's one of the many ways in which they don't have a really coherent message anymore. Like these hearings are very scattershot and nobody's taking them seriously. And with that, we'll pass it over to Ben to talk about Hunter Biden.
Well, speaking of scattershot and not taking things seriously, the so-called Weiss special counsel, the special counsel who was never supposed to require special counsel authority until it turned out he couldn't bring the charges that he never wanted to bring in the first place, but was forced to bring, released his final report on the quote-unquote Hunter Biden investigation and prosecution. And this, I always assumed that Weiss would elaborately lay out this detailed report to kind of whitewash and cover up the fact that he, as a U.S. attorney and then as special counsel, never wanted to bring a prosecution against Hunter Biden, sabotaged and tanked the investigations into the entire Biden international influence peddling scheme and all the ancillary and direct alleged crimes associated with it. And instead, what he did was he actually wrote just a 27-page report, essentially, narrowly focused almost entirely on Hunter Biden and a little bit on Smirnov, the source who supposedly lied to the FBI about the bribes that the Bidens had purportedly received. And he took to this report to do two things, essentially. One, to quote unquote, defend the institutions and create the appearance of there being daylight between the Biden administration and the DOJ, and to defend the DOJ's honor after Joe Biden went out there and gratuitously attacked Weiss and the DOJ in his Hunter Biden pardon for purportedly selectively and vindictively prosecuting Hunter Biden. An argument, by the way, that Hunter Biden's legal team raised in court repeatedly and that judges repeatedly smacked down. And then really to continue the whitewashing, which is to say, Weiss never talks about the size, scope, and nature, extent of the investigation into anything and everything touching on the Biden family international influence peddling schemes, FARA issues, threats to national security, and beyond. He basically, in sort of an aside or kind of in passing, talks about the fact that Hunter Biden earned these millions of dollars and evaded taxes on these millions of dollars due to his dealings with Chinese concern and Ukrainian concern. But that was pretty much it in passing. So he created the appearance of trying to say that the DOJ was trying to carry out justice and that, basically fought back, creating the appearance of having some adversarial relationship with the Biden administration by fighting back against the notion that this was a selective and vindictive prosecution. But by the same token, he, of course, doesn't even attempt to argue against what the IRS whistleblowers had raised, which is that this prosecution had tanked the cases, not pursued all the leads, not done justice here. And he also kind of skates over the whole slapping together of a global immunity, sweetheart, get out of jail free card plea deal that his office rushed to negotiate with Hunter Biden's camp, only because the IRS whistleblowers were coming forward, that was an unprecedented, essentially, agreement, that it collapsed under questioning. He sort of just factually talks about, here was our deal, it collapsed, etc. Really doesn't tell the full story or the context. So the end takeaway is this is exactly, again, like with Smith, a fitting capper to the non-investigation and non-prosecution at play here. And the question remains, to what extent are we going to get ever anything remotely resembling full transparency and accountability, not only about the Biden family's dealings, but then what the nexus was to policies that took place not just under Barack Obama, but for the last 4 years. To what extent during these 4 years have the Bidens prepared themselves for future paydays? Also probably worth noting. And then maybe more importantly and more likely, and something that the Trump administration and Congress might actually look into, what about the damage that the DOJ did here? The apparent attempts to railroad the IRS whistleblowers themselves. To what extent is there going to be a house cleaning? Are there going to be reform efforts associated with what an investigation finds into what this prosecution was doing or not doing in this case? I don't hold my breath that there's going to be any transparency or accountability. Ultimately, I think Americans will quickly forget about the Bidens and view them as a corrupt and failed family, but no more. I think the consequences of the corruption are far more damaging and deep and disturbing than are probably understood. And I think, again, the cleaning of house of the DOJ has to happen, and part of it has to be looking into, again, the tanking of these cases. So curious as to your takeaways. Is this essentially a nothing burger, and are the Bidens going to ride off into the sunset? Is the DOJ going to get off scot-free, or are we going to see some actual changes take place going forward?
I think I have like the ironic take, which is I'm glad that the pardons happened, right? I'm glad Biden pardoned his son because I think it shatters the norm that pardons are sacrosanct. It clears the decks for Trump to pardon whoever he thinks he should, which would be a big improvement over the first administration. And it proves like the whole, again, arbiter of moral rectitude. It's like whenever the Democrats try and do it, become arbiters of who's moral and who's not, cast Trump as this unique threat to democracy and our norms, the rule of law. Then all of a sudden, Joe Biden pardons his son who gives him a 10-year get out of jail free card covering all sorts of corrupt behavior that included and implicated Joe Biden himself. So the fact that, I mean, it's nice to see that, obviously the special counsel is, coming out and being so critical of so critical of the Biden administration for being such hypocrites. That's all well and good. There does need to be an investigation of DOJ as to how some of these sweetheart plea deals got handled. And I think there's a reasonable chance that it will be. But in general, I'm glad to see the whole process get so thoroughly delegitimized. Both the whole Democrat edifice of they're the protectors of democracy and norms of rule of law just get completely obliterated.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a kind of church committee report on all of these. I mean, that's step one. I really think, first of all, dealing with the abuses of justice needs to be, it's one of the most important things that the Trump administration can do. I know it's not quote unquote forward looking, but it's absolutely critical, not only because justice demands it, not only because it's important that the American people understand just how many abuses and what kind were conducted, but also because the trust in these institutions is never even going to start to recover unless there is a kind of transparency and accounting for what has happened. And so I think that kind of committee report would be a good way of doing it. Maybe there's some other administrative way of doing it, but it needs to be done. So the first thing that needs to be done is transparency and accountability, right, for the individuals who took the most egregious actions. But the second part of it, there has to be some kind of systemic reform, right? What has happened is not confined to a small number of political actors. That's the easiest way to think about it, I think, is by, sort of people cackling and putting their hands together. And some of the, struck texts really make people think that, right? But the fact is that most of these kinds of decisions, ultimately prosecutorial decisions, are judgment calls. And so there's an entire class of people making judgment calls that are really, really hard to, definitively say. In some cases, they went well beyond that, but I'm saying like the average case is making a judgment call about whether or not something is prosecutable or whether or not you have a basis to use intelligence, surveillance, for example, on somebody. These are judgment calls, and we rely on not only the individuals making those judgment calls, but on the overall culture within the service, which is why we need some kind of really serious reform going forward. A lot of these people need to lose their jobs, and those that don't have to be retrained into a culture that is totally different from the one that currently exists. So I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but I don't know. Personally, I will be. That is very high on my list, even to some extent above some of the more forward-looking concerns like immigration and foreign policy, all of which, of course, are critically important. But we can't have intelligence services and an FBI that is politically weaponized against Americans. And how the Trump administration goes about fixing that is going to be really difficult. I guess it's good that Pam Bondi has not one but two hearings.
I don't have much to add here except on the question of the Biden family. Consider me a pessimist as to them ever actually being held accountable for their litany of alleged crimes. But I think at the same time, Ben, you're right that this will not be a family that is remembered with the likes of the Kennedys or other families that are considered sort of American royalty, even though, everybody else was pretty much corrupt too. But I don't think they'll have that same long-lasting legacy that other presidential families enjoyed, at least in part because Biden's administration was such a dismal failure that the corruption is almost like a cherry on top of just really abysmal policy making and decision making, plus the fact that he's now remembered as the president who had to step aside from his own reelection campaign because, as he said in a USA Today interview last week, even he didn't know if he could make it through another 4-year term. So all of those factors, I think, will render him a pretty moot point in the memories of Americans, which is a good thing to an extent, but also not the best thing because people should be forced to study the Biden administration to understand how to avoid being so horrible at your job.
All right. With that, I'll move on to final thoughts. I have a really simple one. It's we need to bring some laughter and levity into NatCon Squad. We don't do it enough, and so I just want to echo the announcement by Jennifer Rubin and Norm Eisen that they're setting up a new outlet to combat the authoritarianism of the Trump administration. They're calling it the Contrarian.
So good.
Which is the least appropriate name in the history for that particular outlet. They were parroting the establishment line for 10 years about the Trump and the leading people charging forward with prosecute Trump, prosecute him aggressively, which was the most mainstream media line. And the moment Jeff Bezos was like, I don't know if we as a paper should be taking such an aggressively partisan position. They're like, I quit. We're contrarians now. We're against the establishment. We're so ideologically independent. Jennifer Rubin, ideologically independent. It's hilarious, wonderful to see these people reduced to being Substack bloggers and that Jeff Bezos will no longer pay their salaries.
I'm going to jump in here because I had a related thought, which one other thing I'll mention about the Contrarian is that apparently they're doing a pro-democracy cookbook, and it's going to be filled with plenty of humor, they say. I mean, you really just can't write this stuff. It's so delicious. But on a more broad general note, it seems like the mainstream media is kind of imploding right now. You have Rashida Jones leaving MSNBC and being replaced by the architect of CNN Plus, which, if I remember correctly, lasted 3 months and bled millions of dollars. The LA Times, relatively new owner, said that the paper should regret endorsing LA Mayor Karen Bass. He's fired a bunch of the editorial board, obviously what Bezos is doing at the Washington Post. And then if you look at subscriber numbers, readership, it is down across the board, not to mention places like HuffPost, Washington Post, and there's a couple of other outlets that are slipping my mind right now, have been doing layoffs since the start of the year. So just every facet of the mainstream media seems to be in decline right now. Of course, because of the lack of trust among readers, but also because of all of this internal squabbling that they've gotten themselves into by hiring so many activists posing as journalists. It's like the senior leadership that is probably like very liberal, but maybe kind of believes in journalistic principles is coming up against this young, progressive, pure activist group, and they're just eating each other alive. And I, for one, am enjoying watching it.
Yeah, just to continue briefly on the contrarian take. I love this Nick Claremont tweet. News: I have resigned, quote, been fired from my job, taking money for years from someone I now claim it was immoral to take money from. I'm starting a media company exactly like several other media companies. Our value add is that we think Trump is bad. Subscribe to the derangement. I think that that's just like the perfect
Banger
encapsulation.
tweet.
Yeah. Um, on a different note, IWF has a new report. My boss and I, Mailman, and I have put together a report on something you would think that as the libs say, the current year, we would be actually over arguing. It feels like we've won to some extent the argument over the delusion of people being able to change sex, and yet this is still very much part of the law, even in cases where it is obviously incredibly dangerous. And one of those cases and one of those instances is putting men into women's prisons. So we have a report out showing where that's happening, how it has been happening, how it's been becoming policy, and how what policies, just a list of policy suggestions, both on the federal and state level, to stop that from happening. I mean, I don't need to explain to anybody listening to this podcast why it's ludicrous to put men in women's prisons, but I'll just further note that a huge percentage of these men are convicted sex criminals. So we are literally putting convicted sex criminals, because they say that they are women, we are putting them in the women's prison. That is happening right now. I know that it's another one of those things that seems too crazy to be true, and nevertheless it is, and it's continuing into 2025. So the report's called Cruel and Unusual Punishment, Stopping the Dangerous Policies, Putting Men in Women's Prisons, and you can look it up on IWF.org or on Fox or one of the outlets where they're covering it.
Last week, Mark Zuckerberg went on his pro-free expression tour, took that tour to the Joe Rogan show, and he said something which had me kind of dumbfounded, maybe not surprised, but maddened at the notion that he didn't raise this when it could have actually made a difference, when Zuckerberg said that he thought that what the Biden administration was doing in pressuring Meta et al. To censor protected speech was illegal. Why Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't have come in and testified in the Missouri v. Biden case, opened up the Facebook files for that case, wrote an amicus brief when it went before the Supreme Court, etc. We'll never know. I think the best way to look at it, the most charitable interpretation, is that he didn't want to cross the administration, which is why he had to fold and comply to some of the administration's demands. And he further did not want to cross the administration, obviously, by entering into litigation, participating on the side of the plaintiffs against the administration. So disheartening. I'm glad it's on record now, at the very least. I'm glad that the Rogan podcast and Zuckerberg's comments generally have exposed some of the depredations of the censorship industrial complex. Worth noting, the Supreme Court put out a year-end report for 2024, wherein Chief Justice Roberts listed disinformation as one of the 4 key threats to the independent functioning of the Supreme Court. That shows you, and if you read, he talks about there needs to be a national effort to counter disinformation. This shows you that the Supreme Court is not necessarily going to be a favorable venue. It clearly wasn't in Murphy v. Missouri, may not be a favorable venue going forward to combating the censorship industrial complex. So ultimately, it's up to the executive and legislative branches to do their duty to protect our rights here. And I hope in that regard that as the Trump administration seeks to dismantle and destroy the censorship industrial complex, and potentially hand in hand with Congress, that Mark Zuckerberg will prove an ally there. It's not going to make up for all of the censorious conduct of Meta or maybe the self-serving behavior that we're seeing now, but it would still be all to the good. So I hope that he will work with those who want to destroy and dismantle the censorship industrial complex to codify these changes, again, via executive action and the law, because the courts are not going to be a panacea here, unfortunately.
All right, I think that does it for us. On behalf of Ben, Amber, and Inez, I'm Will Chamberlain. Thanks for tuning in. See you at the next NatCon Squad.